Equal protection of the laws. Section 1, Article 3. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property, nor shall, without due process of law, nor shall any person be denied of the equal protection of the laws. Meaning, persons protected. All persons or things similarly situated should be treated alike, both as to rights conferred and responsibilities imposed. Natural and juridical persons are entitled to this guarantee, but with respect to artificial persons, they enjoy the protection only insofar as their property is concerned. Scope of equality. Economic. See constitutional provisions on free access to courts. Section 11, Article 3. Marine wealth reserved for Filipino citizens, and Congress may reserve certain areas of investment. Reduction of social, economic, and political inequities. In Tan versus Del Rosario, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of RA 7496, limiting the allowable deductions from gross income of single proprietorships and professionals. It was held that uniformity of taxation does not prohibit classification, provided that the requirements of valid classification are complied with. Political scope of EPC. See constitutional provisions on free access to courts, bona fide candidates being free from harassment or discrimination, reduction of social, economic, and political inequities. The Constitution, as a general rule, places the civil rights of aliens on an equal footing with those of citizens, but their political rights do not enjoy the same protection. In Peralta versus Comelec, the court upheld the adoption of block voting, saying that if a candidate wishes to avail of the advantage of block voting, he was free to join a party. In Sinisa versus Comelec, the law excluding residents of Mandawi City from voting for provincial officials was justified as a matter of legislative discretion, and that equal protection would be violated only if groups within the same city were allowed to vote while others were not. In Unido versus Comelec, the court denied the request for the opposition for equal time and media coverage for its Plaza Miranda rally, as that was given to President Marcos because the head of the state of every country in the world must, from the very nature of his position, be accorded certain privileges not equally available to those who are opposed to him. In criminal process, Section 11, Article 3 ensures free access to courts. In Gumabon versus Director of Prisons, petitioner who had been sentenced to life imprisonment for the complex crime of rebellion with murder were ordered released after 12 years of incarceration, when in People versus Hernandez, the court ruled that there's no complex crime of rebellion with murder, as much as common crimes are deemed absorbed in the crime of rebellion. In Nunez versus Sandigan Bayan, the constitutional mandate for the creation of a special court to hear offenses committed by public officers was the authority to make the distinction between the prosecution of dishonesty in public service and the prosecution for crimes not connected with public service. Social scope of EPC. See Section 1, Article 13. Valid classification. Persons or things ostensibly similarly situated may nonetheless be treated differently if there is a basis for valid classification. The requisites are: 1. Substantial distinctions which make for real differences. In Mirasol versus DPWH, where the petitioners assailed the validity of DPWH Admin Order No. 1, which prohibited motorcycles on limited access highways on the basis of RA 2000 Limited Access Highway Act, the Supreme Court held that there is a real and substantial distinction between a motorcycle and other motor vehicles. Not all motorized vehicles are created equal. Real and substantial differences exist between a motorcycle and other forms of transport, sufficient to justify its classification among those prohibited from plying the tollways. In Philippine Association of Service Exporters versus Derelon, it was held that Filipino female domestic workers were in a class of themselves because of the special risk to which their class was exposed. In Conference of Maritime Manning Agencies versus POEA, there was found substantial distinctions between a land-based and sea-based Filipino overseas workers because of the dissimilarities of work environment, safety, danger to life and limb, accessibility to social, civil, and spiritual activities. In JMM Production and Management versus Court of Appeals, the court upheld the classification on the ground that the Dole order applies to all performing artists and entertainers destined for jobs abroad, as they are prone to exploitation and abuse, being beyond the physical reach of the government regulatory agencies. In Dumlao versus Comelec, the court upheld the validity of law disqualifying from running for the same elective office for which he retired any retired elective provincial or municipal official who has received payment for retirement benefits and who shall have been 65 years of age at the commencement of the term of office to which he seeks to be re-elected or elected. In its resolution on the motion for reconsideration in Tolentino versus Secretary of Finance, the court rejected the contention that the exemption from VAT of electric cooperatives and sale of realty to homeless poor violated the Equal Protection Clause. The classification between electric and other cooperatives rests on a congressional determination that there is a greater need to provide cheaper electric power to as many people as possible, especially in rural areas, and there's a difference between the homeless poor and the homeless less poor, because the latter class can afford to rent houses in the meantime that they cannot yet buy their own homes, while the former cannot. In Ichong versus Hernandez, the court upheld the validity of the retail trade nationalization law, despite objection that it violated the Equal Protection Clause because there exist real and actual, positive, and fundamental differences between an alien and a national. In preventive suspension of a policeman lasting until the termination of a criminal case against him, as provided in Section 47 RA 6975, the ALG Act of 1990, does not violate the policeman's right to equal protection of laws. There is a substantial distinction between policemen and other government employees. Policemen carry weapons and the badge of law, which can be used to harass or intimidate witnesses against them. Besides Section 42 of PD 807, the Civil Service Law, which was raised as an argument for equal treatment, refers to preventive suspension in admin cases, not in criminal cases. In Himagan versus People, it was held that the fact that the ombudsman may start an investigation on the basis of an anonymous letter does not violate the Equal Protection Clause. Firstly, there can be no objection to this procedure because it is provided in the Constitution itself. Secondly, in permitting the filing of complaints in any form and in any manner, the framers of the Constitution took into account the well-known reticence of people which kept them from complaining against official wrongdoing. Finally, the office of the Ombudsman is different from other investigatory and prosecutory agencies of government because those subject to its jurisdiction are public officials who, through official pressure and influence, can quash, delay, or dismiss investigations held against them. In Telecommunications versus Broadcast Attorneys of the Philippines versus Comelec, the court found substantial distinctions between the print and the broadcast media, which would justify different treatments under BP 881, vis-a-vis the physical limitations of the broadcast spectrum and the pervasive presence of broadcast media in the lives of people, and the earlier ruling that the freedom of television and radio broadcast is somewhat lesser than the freedom accorded to print media. In Lacson versus Executive Secretary, it was held that the petitioners' and the interveners' right to equal protection of the law was not violated by the enactment of RA 8249 because the law was not directed only to the Coratong Balalang cases. Every classification made by law is presumed reasonable, and the party who challenges the law must present proof of arbitrariness. On the other hand, in People versus Halosos, the court ruled that election to the position of congressman is not a reasonable basis for valid classification in criminal law enforcement. The function and duties of the office are not substantial distinctions which lift him from the class of prisoners interrupted in their freedom and restricted in the liberty of movement. Lawful arrest and confinement are germane to the purposes of law and apply to all those belonging in the same class. Likewise, in International School Alliance of Educators versus Kisumbing, it was held that there was no reasonable distinction between the services rendered by foreign hires and local hires as to justify the disparity in the salaries paid to these teachers. In GSIS versus Montes Claros, in declaring invalid Section 18 of PD 1146, it provides that a surviving spouse has no right to survivorship pension benefits if the surviving spouse contracted marriage with the pensioner within 3 years before the pensioner qualified for the pension. The Supreme Court said that the classification does not rest on substantial distinctions. If the purpose of the proviso is to prevent deathbed marriages, there's no reason why the proviso reckons the 3-year provision for the date of the pensioner qualified for the pension and not the date of the pensioner not from the date the pensioner died. It lumps all marriages contracted within 3 years before the pensioner qualified for pension as having been contracted primarily for financial convenience. Germane to the purpose of the law, second requisite of equal protection, or the valid classification under Equal Protection Clause, must be germane to the purpose of the law. The distinctions which are basis for the classification should have a reasonable relation to the purpose of the law. 3 or C, not limited to existing conditions only. In People versus Kayat, the Supreme Court upheld the validity of a law prohibiting members of non-Christian tribes in drinking foreign liquor on the ground that their low degree of culture and unfamiliarity with the drink rendered them more susceptible to its effects. In Ormoc Sugar Corporation versus Treasurer of Ormoc City, the ordinance was declared invalid because it taxes only centrifugal sugar produced and exported by the Ormoc Sugar Company and none other, such that if a new sugar central is established in Ormoc, it would not be subject to the ordinance. D, and the fourth requisite of a valid classification, it must apply equally to all members of the same class. In Philippine Judges Association versus Parada, which withheld the franking privileges formerly granted to the judiciary but remained with the executive and legislative departments, was declared unconstitutional because the 3 branches of government are similarly situated. In Villegas versus Wee Chong, the ordinance imposing work permit fee of 50 pesos upon all aliens desirous of obtaining employment in the city of Manila was declared unconstitutional because the fee imposed was unreasonable and excessive, and it failed to consider substantial distinctions in situations among individual aliens who were required to pay it. In Olivares versus Sandigan Bayan, it was held that when the mayor issued a permit in favor of unidentified vendors while imposing numerous requirements upon the Baclaran Credit Cooperative, he violated the Equal Protection Clause because he failed to show that the two were not similarly situated. The constitutional right to equal protection of law is not violated by an executive order issued pursuant to law granting tax and duty incentives only to businesses and residents within the secured area of the Subic Special Economic Zone and denying them to those who live within the zone but outside the fenced-in territory. The Constitution does not require absolute equality among residents. It is enough that all persons under like circumstances or conditions are given the same privileges and required to follow the same obligations. In short, a classification based on valid and reasonable standards does not violate the Equal Protection Clause. In case of Chu versus Court of Appeals, this was reiterated in Coconut Oil Refiners Association versus Torres. But the compromise agreement between the PCGG and the Marcos family, providing that the assets to be retained by the Marcos family are exempt from all taxes, violates the Equal Protection Clause. Any special grant of tax exemption in favor of the Marcos family would constitute class legislation. From the case of Chavez versus PCGG.